I think the government should look into it and tell us more about it. And I want to know why, in many cases, the police at first appeared to be doing an investigation and then called it off and said, no, there's nothing else to investigate.
More than 20 scientists and engineers died in Britain between 1982 and 1990. Not in a war, not in a lab accident, and not all at once, but one by one over 8 years, and in very strange ways. So much so that coroners kept returning something called an open verdict, which is basically the official version of, we don't know what the F happened here. Most of these men worked in defense. And we're talking high-level classified weapons systems kind of defense. And a significant number of them were connected in one way or another to a single company, Marconi. Is there an explanation for all of this? Well, maybe. Is there a conspiracy? Well, maybe to that too, and we'll get there. This is the scareful story of the Marconi Murders, or, as I like to call it, the Marconi Conspiracy. If you're new to the channel, welcome. And if you're a returning viewer, welcome back. I'd really appreciate it if you would like, comment, and subscribe. Do all the normal YouTube things. None of it costs you a penny, and it really helps to get the video pushed out to more people. In the last video that I did about the missing or murdered American scientists that the federal government is now investigating, I mentioned that this isn't the first time something like this has happened. And so I thought I would go back in time to the Cold War and cover the Marconi Conspiracy or the Marconi Murders. So let's get into the story. Marconi Electronic Systems was, in the 1980s, one of Britain's biggest defense contractors. They made radar systems, missile guidance, underwater weapons technology. It was the kind of work that came with very high security clearances and things that you weren't allowed to talk about once you got home. A lot of their projects intersected with something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Ronald Reagan's Star Wars program, as we called it back then. This was a plan to build a space-based missile shield that would, in theory, make Soviet nuclear weapons obsolete. It was ambitious, expensive, and exactly the kind of thing that Cold War adversaries would have had a strong interest in disrupting. The people working on these projects were scientists and engineers. They were all very smart people, typically in their 30s, 40s, but some a little younger. And starting in 1982, they started dying in very strange ways. A journalist named Tony Collins, writing for a publication called Computer Weekly, started hearing about these deaths in the mid-80s and started keeping track of them. By the time he was done, he'd cataloged 25 cases that he thought were connected. He wrote an entire book about it. He could never prove that it was a conspiracy, but he couldn't just explain away the deaths either. And that's where this story lives. It starts with Dr. Keith Bowden in March of 1982. Bowden was a senior computer scientist working as a contractor for GEC Marconi, that's General Electric Company Marconi, one of Britain's biggest defense and electronic firms. One evening, he attended a social event in London. On the drive home, his car crossed a divided highway, went off a bridge, and crashed down an embankment into an abandoned rail yard. He died on impact. Police said that he was drunk and driving way too fast, but his wife said that that wasn't right. And friends who were with him that night said he hadn't been drinking at all. His attorney hired an accident investigator to look at the car. The tires had been swapped out. Bowden's car normally had very good, maintained tires. The ones on it when he died were old and worn. Maybe he just hadn't gotten around to replacing them and no one had noticed, and that's certainly possible, but it's also the kind of detail that you keep coming back to, just wondering, did somebody swap out the tires? A few years after Bowden died, there were other deaths, scattered enough that no one really was connecting them. There was a radar designer and a man who fell from a hotel window. The pace was slow, and it looked like isolated incidents. But then we hit 1986. Dajibai was 24. He worked at Marconi on the computer control systems for Stingray torpedoes. In August of 1986, he jumped from the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol. The coroner returned an open verdict. And what really strange, because somebody jumping from a bridge isn't all that strange. Horrifying, but not all that strange. What made it strange was what was found when his body was recovered. His pants were around his ankles, and there was a small, needle-sized puncture wound on one of his buttocks. The Bristol coroner said years later that it was a mystery then and remains a mystery now, which is a pretty extraordinary thing to still be saying years after the death. So what happened there? Did he commit suicide? Why would his pants be around his ankles? Perhaps jumping into the water pushed them down, but that doesn't explain the needle-sized puncture wound. I'm not sure that anything has ever explained that. 2 months after this, another Marconi scientist traveled to the same city of Bristol. His name was Arshad Sharif. He was 26. He worked on satellite guidance systems. His death was probably the most disturbing of them all. Sharif tied one end of a rope around his neck and tied the other end to a tree. Then he got back into his car and floored the accelerator. The coroner specifically noted that Sharif and Dajibai had no known connection to each other. Two unrelated men, both working on classified Marconi projects, and both traveled to the same city and died in unusual circumstances within weeks of each other. I find this one really disturbing just because I can't imagine how he thought that up. Most people would just hang themselves. They wouldn't actually get back into the car, and then wouldn't he be pulled out of the car? I can't even imagine what that looked like when they found him. A relative who came to identify Sharif's body noticed something on the floor of the car near the accelerator, and what it appeared to be to him was a metal rod. The coroner's actual words were, "This is past coincidence." Did somebody put the metal rod in the car to force the accelerator down? Or was the rod in the car for some other reason and rolled to the front given the acceleration? Or does it have nothing to do with this at all? Or did Sharif use the rod to help accelerate the car, afraid that he would pull his foot off? It's really hard to say, and I don't think anyone knows. The coroner said he wouldn't close the inquest until he understood how two unconnected men had ended up in the same city under these circumstances. He never did get an answer. It later emerged that both men were believed to be working on a classified project called Cosmos, which dealt with underwater guidance systems. That was the connection investigators hadn't seen coming. And this is the point where you kind of have to decide, what do you think is going on? Because it only gets stranger from here. Now we hit 1987, and it stops feeling like isolated incidents. In January, Richard Pugh, a computer expert who consulted for the British Ministry of Defense, was found dead in his apartment. His feet were bound, a plastic bag was found over his head, and a rope was coiled around his body. The verdict? Accidental death by sexual misadventure. Then just days later, Dr. John Britton, another scientist doing secret work for the Ministry of Defense, was found dead in his garage. Cause of death? Carbon monoxide poisoning. The next month, Marconi engineer David Skeels was also found in his car. The garden hose connected to the exhaust. His cause of death? Carbon monoxide poisoning. And then, again in February, Victor Moore died of an overdose. Peter Peepel also died of carbon monoxide poisoning, and oddly, he was found not in his car, but jammed underneath his own car with his face near the exhaust pipe in a position that police said seemed physically impossible for him to have gotten into himself. The coroner ruled this one an open verdict. Then, John Whiteman, who supposedly drowned himself in his bathtub, was found surrounded by pill bottles and empty liquor bottles. Whitney Houston, anyone? The autopsy found no trace of drugs or alcohol in his system, however, which I don't even know what to do with that, because what were they all doing there if he didn't actually take them? In March of 1987, David Sands, a senior scientist working on computer-controlled radar, made a sudden U-turn at speed and drove directly into an empty roadside diner. His car was loaded with gasoline canisters. His car and his body were completely destroyed by fire. Sands was identified by his own dental records. In April, Mark Weisner, 24, died and was found with a plastic bag and plastic wrap all around him. This was ruled sexual misadventure. In May and June of that year, 2 more scientists, this time at a defense electronics company that Marconi had just acquired named Plessy, also died. And then in August, 2 senior Marconi figures died by electrocution. Alistair Beckman, 50, had reportedly been working on top-secret Strategic Defense Initiative pilot programs. One Sunday afternoon, he went into his garden shed, attached wires to his chest, pushed them into a power socket, and, with a handkerchief stuffed into his mouth, switched it on. His wife did not believe that he had killed himself. Within hours of his death, men from the British Ministry of Defense arrived at the house and took away files and documents. John Ferry, a Marconi director, died next, having forced stripped electrical wires into his own tooth fillings. I actually might find, I know I said the car one was really bad, but this really horrifies me, I think even more. He stripped electrical wires and forced them into his own tooth fillings in order to electrocute himself. I don't even quite understand how that physically works, and I'll just say this, I was a history major, not much of a science gal, but what in the world? Who would ever dream this up as a way to kill themselves? By 1988, the British press was paying attention. Members of Parliament were asking questions. Trade union leader Clive Jenkins wrote publicly about his members' concerns of what he called statistically incredible clusters of suicides, violent deaths, and murders. This is back when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, and Thatcher's government's official position was that the deaths were a coincidence. The defense industry is very stressful, they said, and men end up dying. A researcher named Professor Colin Pritchard, who specialized in suicide and mental illness, looked specifically at 4 of the cases and found something worth considering. All 4 men he looked at had recently told people close to them that they were being asked to perform strange, impossible, or unscientific tasks at work. All 4 died in methods so extreme that Pritchard said he'd only typically seen them associated with severe mental breakdowns, the kind that render people unable to function, and yet all 4 of these men were employed and working normally right up until the day that they died. All 4 had also recently scheduled appointments with their local members of parliament. Think of them as the British version of going to your congressman. Were they whistleblowing? What were they going to say to the MPs? Nobody knows because the appointments were never kept. And here's where we get into speculation. The theory that got the most traction at the time was foreign intelligence, that the Soviets or East German operatives were targeting British scientists. And for the kids out there in the audience, there was a time when Germany wasn't just Germany. After World War II, it split into East and West Germany, and so the East Germans were controlled by the Soviets and communism. And so the Soviets and East German operatives may have been working together to try to stop the Star Wars project. Not a completely far-fetched idea, and these things weren't just happening necessarily in Britain. In West Germany in 1986, a director who worked as a Strategic Defense Initiative contractor was killed by a car bomb. Another senior Strategic Defense Initiative advisor was shot, and German prosecutors believed that there was a coordinated campaign. Similar incidents were reported in Sweden and Italy as well. It's also documented, generally speaking, that intelligence agencies will stage deaths to look like accidents or suicides because it reduces scrutiny and makes families less likely to push back. Death staged as sexual misadventure is reportedly described in intelligence training as particularly useful because it muddies the investigation before it even starts and makes the victim harder to defend publicly. And you can imagine how awful this is for the families. I mean, the police show up and they find people in very weird situations, and then they're almost like embarrassed by what's happening. And the family could become embarrassed, and then the less attention paid, the better, which makes it all the more perfect if these are actually staged deaths. that people just don't want the government looking into too closely. These theories don't really prove anything. It's just context. It's not a smoking gun, but it's worth considering. And the other thread that never quite gets resolved is whether some of these men stumbled onto something inside their own work, something that made them a liability. The appointments with their members of parliament keep pulling back onto that maybe they were whistleblowing on their own government. Something was bothering them and something that they apparently couldn't go through normal channels to make known. But we will never know what that was because the appointments were never kept. The other side of the conspiracy coin is the skeptical side. Thousands of people worked in British defense in the 1980s. The workforce skewed heavily male and heavily toward the 20 to 49 age range, which is the demographic most at risk for suicide in men overall. Carbon monoxide poisoning was more common before better safety standards, and the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol was, and still is, known as a location for people in crisis. So think of San Francisco and the Golden Gate Bridge. Two unconnected people ending up there and committing suicide is within the realm of possibility. And once the press picked up on the story in 1987, there was every incentive to keep finding connections between deaths. That's how these cycles work. Pattern recognition is something human brains are very good at, and sometimes for good reason, but sometimes it makes us see things that just aren't there. The British government's position was that stress in a secretive, high-pressure industry, combined with the fact that these men often couldn't talk about their work with anyone at home, was a reasonable explanation for the cluster of suicides. And I just don't know. I can see that side of the argument, but then we get to, were the tires swapped on Bowden's car? Why was there a puncture wound on the young man's buttocks? What was the metal rod doing in Sharif's car? The Ministry of Defense arriving at Beckman's house within hours of his death seems suspicious. What were they trying to get out of there so quickly? And Whiteman's toxicology showed nothing in his system, despite the somewhat possibly staged scene around him. There just aren't enough explanations. Those things aren't explained by occupational stress. Tony Collins spent years researching this. His book laid out the cases as clearly as anyone has managed to, and his conclusion was essentially that something was very wrong, but that he couldn't quite put his finger on what that was. The British government never opened a formal inquiry. The death slowed down after 1990. Whether that means whatever was happening stopped, maybe because we were hitting the end of the Cold War, or whether it just means that there never really was a pattern in the first place, depends on whether you tend to believe in conspiracy theories or you're a little on the more skeptical side. I've gone back and forth on this one. I don't know what happened, and I don't think anyone does, and I'm honestly a little skeptical of anyone who thinks they have it all figured out. I could see where some of these people were targeted and had their deaths staged by foreign actors, but I also could see young men disillusioned with life, certainly disillusioned maybe with the work that they were doing. I mean, they were doing very serious work in a very serious time, and maybe they couldn't just take it anymore, and they did end up committing suicide. What I keep going back to, though, is that somewhere around 25 people with security clearances working on classified defense projects during one of the tensest stretches of the Cold War died in the span of 8 mere years. Some in ways that made no physical sense, some in ways in which their own families have refused to accept. And the official answer across all of it was essentially, sometimes things just happen. And maybe that's true, but maybe it's not. These men had families, they had colleagues, and they had appointments that they never made it to. So what happened here, guys? What do you think? Do you think this is just people in hard jobs committing suicide, or do you think there was some aspect of foreign actors and foreign spies going on here? Or was there something that these men found out about their own government, and then their own government took care of that so that whatever was going on would never get out? Let me know in the comments down below, and until next time, stay safe, stay careful, and maybe check your tires before getting into your car.